Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal. I'm your host for today's program and I'm joined by my panelists, Amjad Hussain. Welcome, Amjad.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And Arif Ahmad as well, who are going to today help us understand the Abbasid Caliphate, which was a glorious period within the Islamic civilization. We're going to do this program in two parts. In the first part, we're going to look at the different caliphs, their main achievements. And then in the second part, we're going to look at the actual achievements, some of the key contributions that were made by this glorious civilization. So, if I could just set the scene, the Abbasid Caliphate represented the second of the two great dynasties of the Muslim Empire. It overthrew the Umayyad reign in 750 CE and lasted up to 1258 Christian era, that is CE, when it was eventually devastated by the Mughal Invasion. And then a weakened Abbasid Caliphate was re-emerged essentially in Egypt, which lasted from 1261 to 1517. So let's start with the origin of the Abbasid name. Amjad, if you could just take us through the difference between the Umayyad and Abbasid names.
Oh, thank you very much, Iqbal. As you quite rightly mentioned, the Abbasid Caliphate has its origins and is the third of the Islamic Caliphate, or the successor to the Prophet, peace be upon him. That's the word Caliph, means the inheritor. The first were the four righteous Caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman and Ali, known as the Rashidun Caliphs, or the righteously guided. They were followed by the Umayyads. The Abbasids, or Abbasiya, is the name of the dynasty, is derived from the uncle of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. He was known as Abbas bin Abdul Muttalib. And Abbas bin Abdul Muttalib was the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ. And the Abbasids are one of the longest and the most important caliphates in Islamic history. And they remained in power for over 5 centuries in Baghdad as absolute rulers, and for another 250 years as symbolic caliphs under the Mamluks in Egypt, as you mentioned previously. So this basically, the caliphate in essence continued right up to the 16th century.
If we just go back to how they came onto the scene, clearly the Umayyads had been ruling there, and in the previous programs we've covered some of their achievements, but towards the 718 CE or roughly that period, the Abbasids started coming in the forefront. Arif, do you want to take
Yes,
this?
as we've mentioned in previous programs, as with all empires, eventually the corruption sets in, you start making enemies. And the Umayyads were no different. So the disadvantage, or the negative side of the Umayyads is that they had established more or less a hereditary rule, which was not liked by the other Muslims. Also, they were not very friendly towards the Shiites and also to new Muslims as well. So they were mainly concentrating on the Arab Muslims. So what the Abbasids were able to do was, in effect, build up a coalition. So the new Muslims, the recently converted Muslims, the Persian Muslims, the Eastern Arabs and the Shiites, they were able to bring them together and say, look, these Umayyads, look at what they're doing. And isn't it about time that maybe we should sort of, challenge their rule? And I think it was actually a Persian general, Abu Muslim, who basically started helping the Abbasids and their armies. And it was through his various battles.
Because he started the open revolt in, was it 747?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in 750 AD, the superior army of the Umayyad Caliph Marwan II was defeated by the combined forces, as Arif mentioned, by the Abbasids. The contingents of the Abbasids were led by Abdullah bin Ali, the uncle of the famous Al-Safa and Mansoor, and the Shia Muslim contingent, as Arif Sahib has mentioned, was led by the famous Persian soldier Abu Muslim, and the battle took place at in the place called Zeb in Iraq. Marwan II fled back to Damascus, which didn't welcome him, and he was ultimately killed on the run in Egypt the same year in August. The Persian contingent was mentioned, as Arif mentioned, was led by the famous general Abu Musa al-Khurasani, who was in service of the Abbasids. He basically led the Abbasid revolution that toppled the Umayyad dynasty. And after the Battle of the Zeb, later that year, he marched on to Damascus and captured the city and thus ended the Umayyad rule.
So initially when the Abbasids took over, the power really went to As-Safa, as we call him.
Abu Abbas al-Safa,
Yeah.
yes, and basically, and his brother Mansoor. Initially, the capital was in Kufa. That was also the strong bed of support of the Shia contingents. If you remember, the fourth righteous Caliph Ali radiallahu anh has moved his capital from Medina to Damascus, Medina to Kufa. Like did the Umayyad dynasty, they moved the capital to Damascus. So there were actually two Islamic caliphates parallelly existing, and then the grandson of the Prophet abdicated in favor of Muawiyah, the Umayyad Caliph. And then, of course, Arif mentioned the downfall of the Umayyad Caliphate. They were aggressive towards the minorities, and obviously there was resentment against their rule, which accumulated in the Battle of the Zab, and they were thoroughly defeated. As you mentioned, there are many legends associated with Al-Safa. One tale recounts that he was so concerned that the Umayyad dynasty will return back to power. So Al-Safa invited all the remaining dynasty of the Umayyad families to dinner one night, and where he had them clubbered to death, or it is alleged poisoned, before the first meal was served. Subsequently, that meal was served to the host, and the only survivor, Abdurrahman ibn Muawiyah, escaped to the province of Al-Andalus, present-day Spain. As we know, that's another story.
I mean, sadly, these are the tragic events when dynasties, replace each other. The intrigue, whether you look at European history or Chinese history or Indian history, and clearly in the Muslim world as well, similar sad events also happened. Al-Safa's rule only lasted a short period, Arif, that 750 to 754, but it was really AlMansoor who set the seal on the Abbasid Caliphate, and his descendants virtually, represented the Abbasid dynasty. Do you want to?
That's right. I mean, AlMansoor, although he's the second of the Abbasid Caliphates, many people really recognize him as more or less the first of the real proper ones, generally regarded as a real founder of the Abbasid Caliphate. And he started, obviously, to consolidate the power. So one of the things that he did was basically moving power towards Baghdad. He basically started using a lot more of the Persian influence. So just for our listeners, Persia obviously had a lot to offer. The families from Persia, they were obviously very well educated, and he used them sort of in the civil service to help the administration of the empire. With any empire, you need obviously people to administrate it and to help run it. And he was basically very much in favor of helping the Persians, asking them to help run the empire. Also, what he did was try to develop literature and scholarship in the Islamic world. We'll come on to talk about that in more detail in another program. But this is one of the ways that he did that, by translating everything into Arabic. So I think one of his aims was basically to try and translate all of the knowledge of the world into Arabic, to basically preserve that information. So this was a way that he started to consolidate his power, as I said, and also his influence as well.
Can I just mention, in addition to, before we move on to Al-Mansoor, during the reign of the first Abbasid Caliph, education was highly encouraged. The first paper mills were staffed by the skilled Chinese prisoners who were held, who were captured during the Battle of Talis, and these paper mills were set up in Samarkand. So it opened the door to dissemination of knowledge, reading and writing.
In fact, this is an incredible interaction, isn't it, with the Chinese, where through these different campaigns and wars, they came across papermaking and gunpowder, which we'll cover at some other time. But the actual expansion through all the variety of mills of papermaking took place in the Islamic Empire in a big way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Chinese techniques were further improved and refined. And this started during the time of Al-Safa, and then it continued under Al-Mansoor, basically.
I think, Amjad, another thing we were talking earlier on is the introduction of the Vizier title, because initially Al-Mansoor carried on with the structure and organization as set up by Abdul Malik, the great Umayyad Caliph. but he went on to establish the appointment of the vizier position, which became quite important and had major implications as the empire went.
Absolutely, yeah. The Grand Vizier, the Prime Minister, and in addition to having the Grand Vizier, the Prime Minister, there were also other ministries. There were Minister in charge of the armed forces, there was Minister for Finance, and so basically AlMansoor and reformed the whole bureaucracy, really, and you can say that along the lines that we have today, and he appointed able and governors to the different provinces, and he rotated them and kept them in check and accountable, and of course also they sponsored, it was under AlMansoor, a committee for the translation movement was also made up.
In fact, there was a whole movement, wasn't it?
The translation movement,
yes.
Translation movement initiated under the Caliph AlMansoor. And that lasted, as we know, for a good, 400 or 500 years.
Just one small point, just about these viziers. In effect, sometimes they were so powerful they even had more power than the caliph because of the power that was, seconded to them. So if the caliph was weak, they actually sometimes exerted more power than the caliph. That's how.
Yeah, as I said, this is something that came back to bite them later on. But now AlMansoor died in 775 CE, Christian era. And he was succeeded by his son Al-Mahdi, who ruled for a period of 10 years. Arif, do you want to take us through?
Yes, just one point before we talk a little bit about Al-Mahdi. The ironic thing here is that the Abbasid Caliphs, they were actually saying that the Umayyads had this system of hereditary caliphs, but more or less as soon as they came into power, they thought, well, actually, this is quite a good system, so we'll carry it on. So when Al-Mansoor died, he more or less appointed his son Al-Mahdi as the next caliph. So although they were saying that this was not a good system, they carried it on. So Al-Mahdi, he was basically a caliph for about 10 years. During his time, during his caliphate, because he was quite fond of music and poetry, poets came to the fore, and he was using poetry and musical expression to basically entertain and keep the population happy. And also the city of Baghdad, that basically in effect really blossomed, became a real centre for the Muslim Empire. And what this did was it also encouraged immigrants. As you will know, any popular city, any city that's popular will always attract immigrants. It's no different today. And this helped, in effect, bring in lots of different people. So people from Iraq, Syria, Persia, even Afghanistan, even Spain, they were all drawn towards Baghdad. And Baghdad was not just a home for Muslims. There was lots of other religions that came there, Christians, Jews, Hindus, Zoroastrians. They all came there because they thought, well, that's where everything is happening. That's where the work is. That's where prosperity is. And so this really helped to consolidate Baghdad as a real city of the Islamic Empire.
And again, Amjad, as you mentioned, the Muslims had introduced paper from China, but under Al-Mahdi, with the mills and the expansion of the mills and the translation movement going on, it became a massive
industry, absolutely,
didn't it?
Absolutely. And not just that, just to elaborate what my esteemed colleague Arif has said, the viziers were known as the Burkamids, and that's a dynasty that was a Persian dynasty, a Persian family, and they came from Balakh in present-day Iraq, and one of their forefathers was a Buddhist leader who subsequently converted to Islam. So you can imagine here we have Zoroastrians and the Buddhists who had converted to Islam could ascend to the highest office in the land, i.e. being the prime minister of the land. And so this showed, then of course there were internal intrigues and so on among the Muslims and the Arabs, but then nevertheless, when the Abbasids came in, they tolerated the minorities, and they promoted new converts to Islam.
Al-Mahdi's rule came to an end, and he was succeeded by his son Al-Hadi, who unfortunately didn't last, only had a reign for 1 year, and he died. And then it was taken over by a glorious caliph that's known in Islamic history as Harun al-Rashid. I'm sure that you'll have plenty to say about his reign. Amjad, do you want to says something about his achievements. He came in I think he ruled from 786 to 809 CE.
That's right. Yes. His time was marked by scientific, cultural, and religious prosperity. Islamic art and music also flourished significantly under his rule. He established the legendary library called Bat al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, in present-day Iraq. And during his rule, Baghdad began to flourish as a center of learning, culture, and trade. And during his rule, the family of the Barkamirs, who played a decisive role in establishing the caliphate, also declined. But he moved his court to Raqqa, present-day Syria. So Harun was, in the English, is known as Aaron the Righteous, or Aaron the Just, and he was intellectually, politically, and militarily very resourceful individual. His court and life have been subject of many tales, some factual, some not so factual, and he's legend in his own right. And among the best-known fictional work that is attributed is known as the Book of 1001 Nights.
Oh yes, we're going to come to those. But just Arif, dealing with his early period, I mean, obviously as an intellectual and a supporter of enlightenment and development, he was a great figure. But even when he was young, at the age of 20, he showed his military prowess and successes against the Byzantines, didn't he?
Absolutely. Just for our listeners, the Byzantine Empire was really, in effect, the remnants of the great Roman Empire. Now, although the Abbasid Caliphate was more eastward-looking towards India and towards China, they'd obviously tried and maintain relations with the West. But, of course, there were sometimes some conflicts. So in 782, in the Christian era, there was the invasion of Asia Minor, which was launched by the Abbasid Caliphate. And this was basically, in a way, to basically show the Byzantines who the boss is. You know, every empire wants to exert their influence, and this was commanded by Harun al-Rashid, and they reached, almost Constantinople. Not quite, but that's where they reached. And this was basically just to show the Byzantines their military power, and try and maintain good relations with them by not letting the Byzantines think that they could overtake the Islamic Empire. So he actually, Harun al-Rashid, although he was in a position to assault Constantinople, which was in effect the capital or this power base for the Byzantine empires, one, he didn't have the resources, the ships, but also I think he decided that it was wise to turn back and not to totally overrun that empire.
Now, during this time, Baghdad was a glorious center, probably a city, as they say in the history books, unrivaled by any other city in the world. But one of the things that he did, apart from setting up the Bat al-Hikmah, House of Wisdom, was move the capital from Baghdad to Al-Raqqa. Do you want to...
well, yeah, of course, Iqbal said, yes, Baghdad was flourish into one of the most splendid cities on the planet, and tributes were paid by many rulers to the Caliph, and it became basically the center of the world as it was known then. But for military and political reasons, and to check the ambitions of the Byzantine Empire, he moved the capital to Al-Raqqa, in present-day Syria, which bordered, of course, it's on the Euphrates, and bordered some of the provinces with the Byzantine Empire. And he spent 12 years in that city, and only did he return once to Baghdad for a short while, and of course, Al-Raqqa had good communication line with Baghdad as well as with the rest of the world, and in present-day Palmyra. The agriculture flourished to support the new imperial capital, and from Raqqa, any rebellion in Syria and the Middle Euphrates could also be controlled. So there were military, political, as well as diplomatic reasons for moving the capital.
So, Arif, apart from his contacts with the local Byzantine rulers, he also had contact with Charlemagne in Europe as well, and there's a very interesting incident, isn't it, of exchange of gifts between the two great rulers.
Just to set the scene, Charlemagne, or sometimes known as Charles the Great, was in effect a Western ruler, and again, rulers obviously want to maintain good relations. So I think the gifts that were exchanged was an elephant and also a clock. And how much of this story is actually true or how much of it is actually fiction, we don't know for definite. But the issue about the clock is quite interesting, because this was in effect a mechanical clock, and this was at the time around about 807. And this clock was actually powered by water, and I think at noon every day bells sounded and brass horsemen came out. So, you see these very ornate clocks which you take for granted. But this is about maybe 1,200 years ago. And Charlemagne and his courtiers, they were actually sort of bewitched. They thought that this was some sort of sorcery that maybe al-Rashid was trying to exert over them. So although they accepted the gift, they had some reservations about this, because they thought it was maybe some sort of mystical object that was trying to influence them in some sort of way. But actually it was just a gift from an empire that had developed, and he wanted to share these things with people in the area.
Now, you mentioned the 1001 Nights, and we're probably going to talk in a lot more detail in a second program to that. But he was a great admirer of learning, and he supported so many of the great thinkers of that time with the House of Wisdom project, etc. But he was a far-sighted thinker, but some wonder whether in the succession planning, whether he may have made a mistake, because when he was thinking of leaving the empire with him, he split it between Al-Mamun, didn't he, and Al-Amin, his other son. And
yes.
We learn from Islamic history the problems that created. Take us through that.
Yes, sure. Towards when he knew his days were coming to end, he took his court and his sons on pilgrimage to Mecca, and there he made his last will, and he named Al-Amin to be his successor, and Al-Ma'un he gave him the governor of Khorasan, basically because Al-Ma'mun's mother was of Persian origin, and he thought, well, he'll flourish in Persia and so on. So basically that was the recipe for disasters, because Al-Amin, who was the chief caliph, the main caliph, resented his brother having an autonomous and rival province as a rival center of power. So basically he intrigued to undermine his brother in Khorasan, and thus became known as the Fourth Civil War, or the Fourth Fitna among the Abbasides. And unfortunately it was due to that the general of the brother Al-Ma'un marched on to Baghdad, and he defeated the army of the Caliph. The Caliph was eventually he tried to escape on a boat, and the general insisted that he leave his scepter, the ring, and all the regalia of the office and the seal of the office behind, and the Caliph refused. His boat capsized, he swam ashore, was caught, and eventually imprisoned and executed. So basically then Ma'un succeeded his brother, and thus as they say is that.
And Al-Ma'un again became one of the greatest caliphs in the Abbasid period, and I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about. Do you want to, Arif, just talk a little bit about his great strengths?
Well, there's one thing I just want to come back about. We mentioned it in passing about the use of paper, and some of our listeners might be thinking, what's a big deal about paper? You have to remember that prior to that, basically it was papyrus or other materials that were used. And what paper allowed you to do was, in effect, it could be produced very cheaply. It allowed you to document everything. It also allowed the bureaucracy to be there. So this link with China and this use of paper was very important in progressing the empire and progressing the aims of the empire, because you can mass produce books, you can mass produce paper, you can circulate that. Also, it's very cheap and durable. Books last for a very long time. So I think we just wanted to make that point, that this was, although it might sound like a very, very simple thing these days, you invented paper, it was actually a very important part of helping to develop the empire.
I mean, one of the things we touched on earlier was the founding of the House of Wisdom. Although founded by Caliph Harun al-Rashid, it was actually formally instituted by Al-Mamun, who greatly expanded Amjad.
Yeah, of course, the university, the library, the first scientific conference, and also he's the first, regarded as the first Egyptologist, because the Great Pyramid at Giza, it was first opened by Harun al-Rashid, and to this day, the tunnel that is known as Al-Mamun Tunnel in the Great Pyramid, because it was sealed, had no entrance. So he commissioned on the opening of the Great Pyramid, because apparently people told him that the Great Pyramid had it was a great repository of knowledge and also a great repository of treasures. Of course, none of them were found, but it just shows the Caliph's thirst for knowledge and treasures. And I think he was more interested in more of literary treasures than, of course, worldly treasures as well. He also, not to mention, founded the first observatory in the Muslim world. As we know, of course, maktabs developed in the cities around the 9th century. Maktabs are madrasas, or the seminaries and the schools. And it was not till the 11th century that actually formally a university was established in the Muslim world, known by Nizam al-Mulk, another viziers. It was known as the Al-Nizamiya of Baghdad, but of course it was founded on the great site of the Bat al-Hikmah.
I mean, his desire to collect the great works from the sort of the past was exemplified with his battles with the Byzantines. And quite often, they would sue for peace based on a variety of riches that they'd claim. But it's thought that quite often he would say, well, I want some of the greatest works of literature handed over, and then we can, rather than the riches. Is Arif?
Yes. I think so. I think this was exemplified in the House of Wisdom. This had the greatest selection of books, not just in Arabic. I mean, it had all of the different, Greek, Indian, Persian text. And this was basically then translated into Arabic. But also, the other interesting thing is it wasn't just Muslims that were allowed to study there. All of the different people from these different cultures, whether they were Muslim or not Muslim, they were also allowed to study there. In effect, it became a glorified university, which was basically, although promoting the aims of the empire, involved everybody.
Yes, of course, in addition to that, he commissioned the mapping of the world, founding the first pharmacopoeia, the pharmacy, chemistry, Egyptology I mentioned, and the hospitals as well. And obviously medicine flourished. And
well, there's so much to talk about. We're going to have to go into the second part for this. So let's have a little break at this stage, and then we'll come back to carry on with the discussions. Welcome back. We were talking about Al-Ma'mun's period as the Caliph of the Abbasids, and we reflected on how in the second half of the 9th century, Al-Ma'mun's Bayt al-Hikmah was the greatest repository of books in the world and had become one of the greatest hubs of intellectual activity in the Middle Ages. One of the things that the Abbasids and certainly the Umayyads and many other Muslim dynasties took to heart was the teachings of the Holy Quran and the guidance of the Holy Prophet ﷺ in relation to seeking knowledge and using reason, etc. Arif, do you know?
Well, absolutely. I mean, both from a religious aspect and also from a worldly aspect. Gaining further knowledge, learning and understanding your surroundings. These are also very, very important principles, and they also help you in your worldly life, because all governments want to be ahead and they want to know what's going on. They want to develop new technologies. So although obviously at that time technology and science was in its formative years, this caliph did encourage original research. And things like algebra and mathematics and introduction of the decimal system that came from the Hindus, that was all more propagated and spread throughout the Islamic world. And so, along with all the other contributions such as astronomy and physics, these laws were helping to understand the world around them. And these were very much promoted during his time.
I know, Amjad, we're going to talk in the second program, second part of this, the detailed, the scientists and their contribution, but just to touch on the experimental method as well, because that was introduced by the Muslims during...
absolutely. Of course, there was the great quest to find the elixir of life and transforming base metals into gold. That was the question of all kings, and, to find...
Alchemy.
alchemy, but the byproduct of alchemy basically gave rise to chemistry, because sublimation, distillation, and all the techniques that we have, refining different acids and defining different compounds and so on. So it led to a whole new discovery of sciences, particularly pharmacology, pharmacy, chemistry, and we'll talk about in depth in the second program of hopefully. But to mention, just to elaborate, it started the quest for experimental sciences, how to verify, how to codify, how to, for instance, the astronomical tables that were inherited from the Greeks, in the Almagist, Al-Mamun, he wanted to verify this thing, if these were correct or not, and also wanted to reduce the real size of the spherical sphere of the Earth. So he commissioned new sets of mathematics and new sets of calculation. So this required a whole new form of experimental sciences. So you look at the observations again and you verify the data, and thus started about what the Greeks had done thousands of years ago, had to be recalculated again and recalibrated, essentially. So basically here they initiated the new science of experimentation.
Amjad, also I want to touch on another area. We've obviously spoken about some of the, but there was a slight downside, although it depends how you see it, but that's in relation to the Mu'tazila or Mu'tazilites and movements. Al-Harun was a great supporter of the Mu'tazilite movement, and he oppressed other thinkers who opposed that. Just take us through a little bit of what that was about and why he felt so strongly and oppressed other ideas.
As my esteemed colleague has alluded to, there's emphasis in the Quran towards seeking knowledge, to verifying, because Muslims believe that if God is the initiator and He's created everything in His own image, then it's important to know the laws of God. So basically it was commandment by God and also the commandment of the Prophet ﷺ to seek knowledge, to verify and to recognize the signs of God. And you can only do so if you resorted to experimentation towards intellectual endeavors. And the Caliph Harun and his sons encouraged this endeavor, and a whole new school of thinking called the Mu'tazilites, who were rationalist Muslims, and they realized that, of course, in addition to revelation which the Prophet ﷺ had and which was found in the Quran and the laws to govern your daily lives, intellect was an important source to verify what was the real laws of God, what the commandments of God, and to know how the universe functioned. And of course, a method, finding the Qibla, for instance, real Qibla, the orientation of the prayers, and so on. So they were, in addition to the commandments of God, they were real day-to-day needs for intellectual endeavors. Thus, there was a whole school of learning called the Mu'tazilites that came into
Well, we're
being.
going to touch on this in more detail in the second program, but again, Al-Mamun's rule came to an end, and on his deathbed, interestingly, he dictated a letter nominating his brother to take over the caliphate. Normally, it tended to go from father to son, etc. But he didn't actually pick his son. He picked his brother. Arif, do you want to take over? And
yes.
That again was a very interesting period of Abbasid Caliphate.
So his brother was called, commonly known as Al-Mutassim, and he was the 8th Abbasid Caliph, and he ruled from 833 to 842. It was really, he had a strong personality and strong leadership, and also because of his military background, that really he was appointed as caliphate. And what he did was he sort of involved the Turks. They became more to the fore in his caliphate. So we've mentioned in the past about the Arabs and the Persians. This was a time when basically the Turks would soon become to dominate the Abbasid government. And they basically were involved in a lot of conflict around Baghdad. This was one of the reasons why, in effect, I think a new capital, Samarra, north of Baghdad, that was one of the reasons why that was formed.
Amjad, do you want to take us through this period? Because as Arif says, it was a watershed moment, wasn't it, really, in the Abbasid and the Arab section sort of history of involving greater and greater soldiers from the Turkish and other territories that they captured and incorporating them into the empire in a big way.
Absolutely, yes. And particularly the Turks, the Mamluks, and the Kurdish factions became prominent within the military and civil administration, and of course, the path was open to them because they claimed that under Islam, all Muslims are equal. And all the subjects of the Caliph should be treated equally. They were now fully versed of what the Quran had said and what were the commandments of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that all mankind are equal and all Muslims are brothers. So they could claim, that they had due rights under the Caliphate. And of course, they rose to prominent positions in the military. And of course, they came from the steppe. They were known as the warrior clans. And they were well built as well. And because of their military prowess, they rose to prominent authorities in all offices of state. And particularly in military, they excelled. And the Caliphs, all subsequent Caliphs, greatly came to dependent on the military contingent because they needed to suppress internal dissent, and of course, not to mention there were internal strifes as well and there were counterclaims to the caliphate from the Alawites in particular, the Alawites and also from the Fatimids, who are the Shia factions within the Muslim empires, and we'll talk we'll elaborate a bit more in subsequent.
Arif mentioned the move to Samarra, and I suppose this was another way for the Caliph to establish his authority in a change of regime, a change of direction from the past, because moving Baghdad was so well centered. Even though we had a transient movement to Al-Raqqa under Harun al-Rashid, but Baghdad became the center again, and now he moved it to Samarra. So just showing that there is a change of direction.
Well, there was, and also in Basra and in Kufa and in these are prominent Shia areas, and they still are to this day actually in Iraq, and that division has been throughout the ages, unfortunately. Kufa, Basra had been centers of Shia support, and Shia has had a counterclaim to be of course they claim that the household of the Prophet, the direct descendants of the Prophet, peace be upon him, have more authority to be the caliphs and more claim to the caliphate than the Abbasid, which are the uncles of the Prophet's family, the descendants of the uncles of the families. But the immediate family had more claim to it. And although the Shia Imams, who were the direct descendants of the Prophet, peace be upon him, took a very neutral line and apolitical lines at times, but nevertheless, even Harun al-Rashid and al-Mamun at one time had the great grandson of the Prophet brought from Medina because he feared there might be rebellion against him, and he actually, in a tokenistic way, he appointed al-Mamun in his will that if he was to die, then the great grandson of the Prophet, Imam Musa Kazmi, Imam Rada should be the next caliph, just to appease the Shias in a way. But everybody knew that the great grandson of the Prophet was too old to succeed the caliph in any way whatsoever. So it was just basically tokenistic gesture by the various caliphs to appease the various Shia factions within Islam.
Just one thing I wanted to say about this establishment of this new city, Samarra. If you think about it, one of the ways of, in effect, recalibrating things and resetting things is by establishing a new city, you can bring a new culture. You can also give land, in Baghdad, because it was so big and so complicated. There was no way that the ruler could start saying, well, this land I can now donate to other people. So by establishing a new city, you can donate land to your followers, and that obviously pleases them, that keeps them happy, and that keeps them on your side. And this sort of model has been replicated by many rulers. I think it was actually Louis the XIV who actually did a similar sort of thing with the establishment of Paris.
Yeah, Versailles is a relationship with Paris. I think there were sort of different relationships, weren't there? I mean, one of the things, though, he did was have this continuity with the Mu'tazilite movement and supporting of that. And Arif, I know he had a big fallout, let's put it.
Well, in a sense, what happens was he continued this this philosophy that Mu'tazilim was the thing that people should all stick to, and it became almost a sort of a symbol of authority of the Caliph. That if anybody who opposed this was opposing the Caliph, this was one way of, in effect, of controlling his subjects and saying, look, you must follow. This is the established ideology. This is a principle that you should follow. And of course, there were some people that would wanted to question this, and this is one of the things that actually started to lead to rebellion and eventually the decline of the empire. I think it was one of the main early opponents, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who in 834, he was a challenge to this orthodoxy. And he basically challenged this, and this encouraged other people to obviously then challenge the Caliph as well.
I mean, this was Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Al-Ghazali were two great figures who challenged this. I know I'm not going to go into the detail in this program, but Amjad.
Yeah, of course. What was you see? The main thing was that does the Caliph have absolute authority over religious matters or not? In addition to, of course, issues of dogmatic. There were issues of dogma were problematic for all intellectuals. But was the Caliph really the supreme authority to adjudicate on these matters? Whereas the scholars felt that the office and the authority rested with them. And then, of course, subsequently we discovered that successors to Mamun and other caliphs, particularly during the time of Mutawakkil and his successor Mustansir, they disassociated the office of the Caliph to be a kind of oracles in matters of faith, as it was, and they delegated the authority willingly because it caused so much strife in the community, as it was. So the scholars subsequently took over the authority of being the interpreters of the law.
I mean, in many ways, Al-Mu'tasim was the last of the strong or great Abbasid caliphs, and as the caliphate was passed on to the others, it started declining, and that was the sort of period when the decline started. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, Al-Mutawakkil, he actually replaced the Mu'tazilite thinking. And so there was a change of direction
for issues of controversy, because he thought the office of Caliph could not be embroiled in controversies every single day, and he should not be siding with any one of the factions, and the office of the Caliph should be aloof of spiritual matters, and let the scholars decide what was according to the law and what wasn't, and in matters of interpretations of the Quran and the Sunnah, and these hypothetical philosophical debates should rest with the scholars. And they were not meant to be disgrace and bring controversy to the office of the Caliph.
Just one other point, small point. Obviously, by encouraging open-mindedness and broad-mindedness, this was an attempt, I suppose, to try and appease people and bring everybody closer to the Caliph, because, as you said, their power was waning. There was a number of groups that were opposing them. When people start opposing, they stop paying their taxes. That means the treasury goes down. That means you have less money to spend on fighting your own, bringing your own propaganda or your own military rule. So I suppose this was in a way also maybe a political decision in terms of saying, well, rather than sticking to this rigid ideology, by being more open-minded, more broad-minded, it might encourage people to come back under this caliphate.
I think the reality was, by the end of the 8th century, the Abbasids found they could no longer keep a huge polity larger than that of Rome together from Baghdad. And in 793, the Shiite dynasty of Idrisids set up a state from Fez to Morocco, while a family of governors under the Abbasids became increasingly independent until they found the Aghlabid Empire from 1830. So I'm just turning to yourself. Now we see a period of fragmentation and different dynasties coming up. And I mentioned the start of that. But I suppose the most famous dynasty that separated out was the Fatimid dynasty, which was from 909 to 1171 CE. Just tell us a little bit about that fragmentation and change.
The Fatimid Caliphate, as the name suggests, are Ismaili, the Shia Islamic Caliphate that covered large part of North Africa, the Maghrebs, that's Morocco, Tunisia, and so on, Sudan and Sicily in the latter days. And of course, as the name suggests, they are descendants from, or they claim at least that they are descendants from the Prophet's family. And of course, Prophet married, yet only was succeeded by his, yet only heir apparent to the Prophet was his daughter, not no son. He had no male heir apparent. And the Prophet's lineage continued through his daughter, but his daughter married his cousin and son-in-law called Ali. And of course, after Fatima died, Ali married other ladies as well. So he had children from called the Alawites. But of course, the pure line, the lineage of the Prophet comes from his daughter called Fatima. And the Fatimids had greater claim to the caliphate than all the other people from the Quraysh, or known as Banu Hashim. That Banu Hashim is the great grandfather of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And of course, like we mentioned previously, the Abbasids claim descent from one of the uncle of the Prophet, and thus legitimacy to be the Caliphs of the Muslims. But of course, if you had somehow direct bloodline to the Prophet, you had more, so it was seen in the eyes of the masses, a righteous claim and a better claim than the rival clans. And after we mentioned the fourth civil war, the fourth fitna, that was between the two brothers, Al-Ma'un and Al-Amin, but dating back to Harun al-Rashid himself. The internal strifes and the factions were there, particularly, like I said, the Alawite claim. And while this Al-Ma'un was in Merv, certain Muhammad ibn Ja'far al-Sadiq, the younger brother of Imam Musa Kazmi, the Shia Imam, claimed that he was an Alawite and a Mahdi, and he basically he believed in Zaydi Shia type of imamate and declared himself as a rival caliph in Mecca. He was subsequently defeated, and then he publicly abdicated in favor of the caliph. But this left a bitter raw feeling, because apparently one of the Shia imams called Imam al-Radha, he was brought by the caliph to Baghdad, and there he was alleged that he was poisoned. So there was a great resentment of the Shias against the rival clans, the Abbasids. So hence this is the inception of the rival claim of the Fatimid Caliph, and that's the background to this thing. And they set up the rival caliphate in Cairo in 973 AD.
And they were largely Shias, the Fatimid.
The Fatimids were largely the Shia.
So a real challenge to the Sunni Abbasids.
The Sunni Abbasids.
So, Arif, turning to yourself, we had another great empire from this fragmented Muslim empire, the Seljuk Empire, which lasted from 1037 to 1194. Do you want to talk
give
us
a little
through
bit of information about that? So the Seljuk Empire, or sometimes the Great Seljuk Empire as it's called, this was a medieval Turco-Persian, and they were Sunni Muslims. And they, as I said, originated from the Turks. They controlled actually quite a large area, vast area geographically, from the Hindu Kush right through to eastern Anatolia, and from Central Asia to the Persian Gulf. They basically advanced into mainland Persia, and they also then conquered eastern Anatolia. Now, they were founded by Tughril Beg. I think this was in 1016, and he was raised by...
The name goes...
I think that's presumably the origin of the
but the name, I think, goes to the grandfather.
The grandfather,
Seljuk Beg was the grandfather of Tughril,
yeah.
So that's where they take the name. But as you say, they had quite a large empire, but quite loyal to the Abbasids in many ways.
And also they actually united. They actually did unite the fractured political nature of some of the Islamic world, and also played a key role in the first and the second Crusades. So they were Persianized in their culture and their language, and they did play a big part in the development of the Turco-Persian tradition. And some of the settlement of the tribes in the northwest areas of the empire, this was used for strategic military purposes. And as I said, led to the Turkanization of those areas.
And then, of course, we had another interesting empire, the Ayyubid dynasty from 1171 to 1260. Amjad, do you want to take us through with one of the great names in the Muslim world?
Sure. As the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt started to decline, initially and the vizier of the Fatimids was Salahuddin Ayyubi, known as Saladin in the West, and he founded the Ayyubi dynasty. Basically, Saladin had been a vizier of the Fatimids before he brought the end of the rule, because the Fatimids, towards the end of their rule, started squabbling among themselves. The last Fatimi Caliph did not have an heir apparent, and there was a lot of strife. So basically, Saladin, who was a vizier as well as a military general, he took over the reins of power. There was a massive power.
He served as a vizier for the Fatimids, didn't he? And then,
initially, and also he was also a great military general as well. And there was there was no heir apparent to the last Fatimi Caliph, and on his deathbed, it basically resulted in a chaos. And to prevent the chaos, Saladin took the reins of power, and basically. He founded the Ayyubi dynasty, and this centered initially around Egypt, and then much of the Levant, what is now present-day Syria, Mesopotamia, and then subsequently Hijaz and North Africa, all up to the coastal borders with Tunisia. And most of the kingdom of Jerusalem fell to Saladin after his victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187.
I mean, interestingly, in the West, he is one of those great Muslims that even the West admires quite a lot, isn't it? Because of the interaction during the Crusades, Arif.
He's well known for his chivalry, and my colleague will allude to it.
Well, I think his military prowess, and I think, there's a romanticism to his name. There's been programs that have been made, and of course, that appeals to a lot of people because of his military successes.
Sadly, though, the Muslims were to undergo an invasion that is probably unmatched in history, and that really rocked not only the Muslim world, but I think it rocked the whole world, Amjad, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
The Mughal invasion, which absolutely decimated that, and that was from 1206 to 1258, but just take us through that period, because it just traumatized the Muslim world.
Yes, from 973 to, from 1250 to 1260, the Ayyubi dynasty moved their capital from Cairo to Aleppo, and in 1260 the Mughals ransacked Aleppo and conquered the remaining territories of the Ayyubi dynasty.
1206, I think.
1206, yes. Yeah. And the Mamluks and the Ayyubis and the Kurds were forced out of power, and however, the Ayyubids, they maintained a principality in Hama for quite some time, but obviously the Mongols, they ransacked to most of the Muslim dynasties, the Ayyubis, and the remaining the caliphates in Baghdad as well came under their influence, and they burnt the libraries and the great universities. However, certain Taqiyuddin al-Tusi managed to save some manuscripts, and he fled towards the west.
I think you're correct, actually. In the invasion and the siege of Baghdad was 1258. The 1206 is when Genghis Khan started his empire.
March, yes,
so
yes.
Historically, obviously, he was the founder of the Mughal Empire, and then all his different
Aleppo fell in 1260.
Hulagu basically came to Baghdad in 1258 and absolutely slaughtered everyone he came in sight of. The Abbasids, though, still re-emerged eventually in Egypt again, in Cairo. Do you want to take us through a little bit of that before we finish?
I mean, a lot of people would say that time, 1258, was the sort of the end of the golden era of Islam and the end of that caliphate. But there was a much smaller caliphate that re-emerged in Cairo, and it was basically they had a small loyal following of army from the army.
Mamluk soldiers, which Amjad mentioned earlier on, absolutely.
And so basically they reallocated or relocated to Cairo. And this caliphate, although very weak in nature, not really recognized many people, struggled on really to the early 16th century. I think it was basically 1517 when effectively it came to an end.
Essentially, the golden age of the Abbasid rule had come to an end, and as we discussed earlier on, the great caliphs who'd established the golden age of Islam had passed away. But that's what happens to all dynasties. Well, I think we've had a fascinating discussion about the Abbasid Empire. I wanted to focus in this program on the main rulers, the main caliphs, the impact they had, because they created the right environment for the learning that was to be produced. And in the second part of the Abbasid Caliphate, we're going to look at who some of those great figures were, what contributions they made, and how they've had this lasting impact on the sciences and art and culture. And so thank you for listening to this program. We would welcome any feedback from listeners through email, Twitter, or whatever form. And I hope you look forward to our next program. Assalamu alaikum.